Dr. Hughes, did there come a time when you conducted a forensic psychological evaluation of Amber Heard? And please tell the jury what a forensic psychological evaluation is.
Could you turn it on at the bottom base?
Okay. A forensic psychological evaluation is an evaluation that is conducted for the courts to answer a particular legal question. It contains multiple parts. Ms. Heard is not a client of mine. She's never been in therapy with me. She's not under my clinical care. It is an objective evaluation to determine a particular legal question. Forensic evaluation follows a methodology that what we say it's a multi-method, multi-hypothesis-driven methodology, which means I look at a variety of different documents and data using multiple hypotheses. It's not just one hypothesis, one theory of the case. You're going in looking to see, what possibly could be going on here. And then you use the data to arrive at that opinion. You look for consistency across the data to arrive at that opinion. And the forensic psychological evaluation has many parts. It has the clinical interview part, a structured or semi-structured clinical interview where I'm asking Ms. Heard lots of things about her life, both before Mr. Depp and after. It involves a psychological testing component of the evaluation, which allows me to do a good broad scan of different symptomatologies that people might have in their lives, as well as to have indicators of how she approached the test. Is she defensive? Is she malingering? Is she feigning? Is she exaggerating? It gives me indications about how she approached the evaluation. I review a number of documents, medical records, psychological records, the text, the audio, all the different things that we've had in this case, and then I conduct collateral interviews.
So, Dr. Hughes, just to be clear, do you assume everything the victim reports is true when you conduct these examinations?
No, of course not. I always approach a forensic evaluation with a healthy dose of skepticism. With any forensic evaluation, there exists a motivation that the individual may be telling you something that is not accurate. It doesn't mean that that's there, but you have to control for that and know that you're looking for, again, what does the data tell you, the external data, about what the person is also telling you.
Did the forensic evaluation follow a standard methodology, or was it specific to Ms. Heard?
No, this is my standard methodology that I would use with any individual who's in a forensic matter, and I would be called to evaluate them.
When did you meet with Amber Heard?
Okay, so I met with Ms. Heard for a total of about 29 hours. I met with her for the first time in September 2019. I saw her for 4 visits in my New York City office. That's about 22 hours. And then I saw her twice over Zoom. One was in January 2021. And
Dr. Curry, in answering that question, were you consulting anything?
Dr. Hughes.
Dr. Hughes, I'm so sorry. Dr. Hughes, were you consulting anything? Dr. Curry's here, I guess, as well. That's what confused myself.
I'm consulting my cheat sheet of the dates that I saw Ms. Heard so that I could accurately report to the court. I also have my final designation in front of me so that I could give the most accurate information to what I put in that report.
Okay. And do you want to see that? Okay. Should we just take the break now and have him look at it, or does he want to?
Would you like to look at it now or before cross-examination?
It's just to post it.
Okay, before cross-examination.
Okay,
All right, that's
fine.
fine. Thank you.
Okay. Please continue. I think you were telling us when you saw Ms. Heard.
Sure. So there were 4 dates in person in New York City for a total of about 21 and a half hours. And then I saw her in January 18th, 2021 over Zoom for 3 hours, and then December 27th, 2021 for 4 hours over Zoom.
And what did the evaluation consist of?
So as I stated, the evaluation consisted of psychological testing, a semi-structured clinical interview with Ms. Heard, a review of a whole host of documents relative to this case and medical records and psychological records, and then 3 collateral interviews, 2 with her treating therapist, Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, and also with her mom.
And in the semi-structured clinical interview, what were you assessing?
Well, when someone comes in for the evaluation, you sometimes don't know what you're going to see or what you're going to get. So you absolutely have to do a full clinical interview and have a sense of their life patterns, things that have affected them in their lives, you know, where they have worked, where they have lived, just get a full sense of their sort of being before the incident for which they're talking about. Then I do a full intimate partner violence assessment, looking at all those characteristics that I talked to you about earlier to get a sense of the full structure of and the dynamic of this relationship. I also did looking at what were the effects, what were the psychological consequences of being in that relationship. And I also looked at the psychological consequences of some of the statements that were made by Mr. Depp through his attorney that are part of this, the counterclaim in this lawsuit.
At the end of that process, considering all the data, did you arrive at any expert opinions?
Yes, I did.
All right, I'd like to start with your main expert opinions and then go through those. Can you please tell the jury what your main opinions were?
So like I said, there are opinions embedded within them, but the main opinion is that Ms. Heard's report of intimate partner violence and the records that I reviewed is consistent with what we know in the field about intimate partner violence, characterized by physical violence, psychological aggression, sexual violence, coercive control, and surveillance behaviors.
And what was the other main opinion that you had?
The second main opinion was that that Ms. Heard demonstrated very clear psychological and traumatic effects or the exacerbation of trauma from those statements that Mr. Depp made through his attorney. There were 3 statements that we evaluated to see how they affected her emotionally and psychologically, and it was my determination that they did.
And did you arrive at any diagnostic conclusions?
Yes, I did.
And what were those?
I diagnosed Ms. Heard with post-traumatic stress disorder.
And what, if any, etiology was associated with the post-traumatic stress disorder?
So the etiology is the cause. In order to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have an actual cause. It's one of the few diagnostic entities that we have to have a cause for, and the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp. That was what was pushing the symptoms. That was what's related to the intrusive phenomena. That was related to her avoidance. That was related to her differences in her mood. That was related to her avoidance efforts. So it was the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp.
Okay. Now, let's first go back to the forensic evaluation. You mentioned you reviewed documents. What documents did you review?
So I'm going to refer to my list of documents so that I can be clear for you all. It is a 4-page.
All right.
Dr. Curry, Dr. Hughes. I don't know why I keep
Oy.
doing that. My apologies. Dr. Hughes. I think it's the confusion of having her in the courtroom. Dr. Hughes, if you need to consult your notes to answer something, let us know that you need to consult your notes. Otherwise, try to answer to the best of your ability. And then if you need to do that, just let us know you're consulting your notes, okay? The concern is that you not read from them, that you consult them as you need to, okay?
Correct. I just don't want this to be a memory test of having conducted many documents, 80 pages of notes,
But
and 12 psychological testings to...
You can reference your notes, just don't read from them, okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great. So please tell us what documents you reviewed. Please tell the jury.
Okay, so I reviewed a number of documents, a plethora of documents, most, and I obviously won't read them all, but I reviewed certainly all of Ms. Heard's testimony that she gave in her deposition testimony in this case, her deposition or her trial testimony in the UK case. I did the same thing for Mr. Depp. I reviewed his deposition testimony as well as his trial testimony in the UK as well. I reviewed a a number of the depositions that were put forth in this case. I reviewed the psychological treatment notes for Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, Dr. Laurel Anderson, and Dr. Amy Banks, although she did not have treatment records. So I reviewed not only their records, did collateral interviews with some of them, and also read their deposition testimony, and also read other medical records in this case, nursing notes in this case, in the highlights. And I also listened to the audios that were put forth in this case and read the text messages and emails.
And what, if anything, did you do with respect to any videos?
And I also saw the video in the kitchen, yes.
Okay. Now, the collateral interviews that you conducted, why did you conduct those?
Well, collateral interviews is a standard part of a forensic evaluation. It's an opportunity to hear from another treating clinician, the person who's actually treating the individual you're evaluating, and get a better sense from that person of what they saw, what they knew, how they experienced this person. Sometimes our clinical notes don't give the full breadth of what really was going on in that therapy, because the notes are meant to be sort of short and to the point of what happened, who was there, and what was the plan. So it was really helpful to talk to these two clinicians who really were with Ms. Hurd throughout the duration of her relationship with Mr. Depp. So they give us sort of a contemporaneous look at what was going on for her emotionally, and then what was she reporting, what was she saying about the relationship to her therapist.
And you mentioned the name Dr. Bonnie Jacobs. Please tell the jury who Dr. Bonnie Jacobs is.
So Dr. Bonnie Jacobs was Ms. Hurd's therapist, and may I refresh my recollection with my notes, Your Honor?
She's allowed to
For the
consult her
dates,
notes.
if you'd like me to tell the dates.
If she's asking me a question,
Oh,
I'm not going to answer.
you're right, Your Honor. Yes.
May I?
Yes, you may consult your notes, yes.
Objection, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So she treated with Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, who is a psychologist, from October 2011 through August 2014. She actually was seeing Dr. Jacobs somewhat earlier, before she got in the relationship with Mr. Depp. And then she transferred care to Dr. Connell Cohen, who was referred by Dr. Kipper, who was the treating physician for Mr. Depp, and then later for Ms. Hurd. And she treated with Dr. Cohen from after she left Dr. Bonnie Jacobs in September 2014 to June 7th, 2016.
Okay, thank you. And so and I guess you got ahead of me there, so you also talked to Dr. Connell Cohen, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you also spoke with Paige Hurd, did you say?
That's correct.
And who is Paige Hurd?
Paige Hurd is Amber Heard's mother.
Okay. And when did you speak with Paige Hurd?
I spoke with all of these individuals at the end of 2019. Again, I can check my notes and let you know the exact date if you'd like.
I think the end of 19.
Yeah, they all were in
is
the
fine.
end of 19, yes.
All right. And you are you aware that Paige Hurd has since died? She died 2 years ago?
Yes, I am aware, sadly.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the psychological testing. You stated that you conducted psychological testing, is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you
Overruled all out.
Can you please tell the jury how many psychological assessments you administered to Amber Heard?
I administered 12.
Can you please tell the jury which ones you administered?
So I am going to refer to my designation that has the list so that I don't forget anything.
Okay.
So I administered,
Objection, hearsay, Your Honor.
She can refresh her recollection.
As long as she's not reading it.
Right. You just can't read. You're not supposed to read from it, but you can refresh your recollection as you're speaking.
so I can look and just look up and that's refreshing my recollection? Okay.
All right, if we could approach for a moment.
Can you tell the jury the tests that you administered, please?
Yes, I can. I administered the Personality Assessment Inventory, which is a broadband instrument to scan for psychopathology and psychological symptoms that people have. I administered the Trauma Symptom Inventory 2, which is an instrument to scan for common traumatic effects that people have. I administered the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test, which is a measure of malingering. I administered the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Checklist for the 5th edition for the DSM-5. I administered the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5. I administered the Beck Depression Inventory, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, the Mood Disorders Questionnaire, the danger, I did 3 intimate partner violence measures, the Conflict Tactics Scale, the Abusive Behavior Observation Checklist, and the Danger Assessment Scale. And then I also did the Life Events Checklist, which scans and gets us to ask about a lot of traumatic events that an individual may have experienced, and we administer that typically before either doing the PCL or doing the CAPS.
Thank you. Were there any tests you administered to Amber Heard that were designed to reveal malingering or feigning?
Yes, there were.
Okay, can you please tell the jury about those?
So malingering is the false production of psychological symptomatology for the purpose of some external material gain. Feigning is the false production of psychological symptomatology with no identification of what that gain may be. So basically feigning is saying your mental health is worse than it actually is. So I administered 3 of the tests, had validity indices built in that could allow us to address that question. The MFAS, the Miller Assessment, a Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test, is a specific malingering instrument. It looks at malingering psychopathology. Is this someone, malingering psychopathology? She scored a 0 on that scale. So on that test, sorry, not the scale, that test. So on that test, there was no evidence of malingering. On the TSI, there are 2 validity indices, and she scored within the normal range on those scores as well. One was slightly elevated, but when in testing the limits, because it has rare symptoms and over-endorse symptoms, I determined that also was a valid measure. And then finally, the PAI, the large scale 344 question instrument, has very robust validity scales on it to test for exaggeration or feigning or malingering, and she did not score in any of those scores and those scales at all. Those were not elevated. So the combined results between those 3 tests suggest to me that Ms. Heard is not malingering her psychological symptomatology.
Now, Dr. Curry testified that one test showed, quote, intentional exaggeration in the 98th percentile, meaning that she engaged in extreme levels of exaggeration, end of quote. Do you agree with that?
I do not.
Why?
Because that test, the scale that she is referring to it's called ATR, it's the Atypical Response Scale. As I said, that combines rare symptoms and over-endorsed symptoms. It's very frequently elevated in people who have high levels of distress. And then importantly, on this test specifically, it says, do not use the percentile rank. It is in the manual, it is in italices, because the way that this test was normed, it was normed on people who have trauma. So it's what we call negatively skewed. That means it falls on the tail end of the continuum. It is not a normal curve where we would normally think of how a percentile would work. So you would not use the percentile rank on this test.
You want to approach?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Dr. Hughes, please continue.
So that is a very inaccurate way to describe that scale and that test. And so the ATR scale on this test is probably the least robust of our validity scales, so you would never make a comment like that based on one scale if you don't have consistency across data. And when you look at the consistency across the testing with the PAI, the TSI, and the MFAS, and there's research to support that when they go together, you have a higher degree of likelihood that this is not feigned PTSD, that this is not feigned symptomatology. And then actually, if I look at the validity scores on the MMPI-2 that Dr. Curry administered, those scales are not elevated for exaggeration or malingering either. So if I add that, now I have really robust data that Ms. Hurd is not malingering or feigning her psychological symptomatology.
Thank you. Did you administer any tests that are specific to domestic violence?
Yes, I did.
Which ones?
So that was the conflict tactics scale, the abusive behavior observation checklist, and the danger assessment scale.
And what did they show?
I would like to refer to the testing.
To refresh
To
your
refresh
recollection?
my recollection, just a glance, so I
Yes,
can
you may
be
do that.
clear with the jury. So what the overall gist of the testing was that, and the benefit of these tests is that they allow me to ask for what Mr. Depp did to Ms. Hurd, and then also what Ms. Hurd did to Mr. Depp. So it was asking about both sets of behavior. And what
Objection, Your Honor. We're back to reading.
She wasn't even looking down. She was looking at the jury.
I don't, go ahead, go ahead.
Please continue.
So what these tests show was that there was a high degree of serious violence perpetrated by Mr. Depp toward Ms. Hurd. There was violence more on the mild level perpetrated by Ms. Hurd toward Mr. Depp, with one severe indicator, which was the punching that she indicated to me. There were scales about negotiation, about how much this couple tries to figure out their problems. They both scored, again, this is Ms. Hurd reporting that, but they both scored in the high range where they're both saying that, yes, we're trying to figure this out, we're trying to work out this relationship. There were scores on the psychological aggression scale where Mr. Depp engaged in more severe acts of psychological aggression, whereas Ms. Hurd did engage in also some mild and severe acts of psychological aggression. The amount of injury that was reported was significantly higher and more severe by Ms. Hurd, what she was subjected to, and then she was subjected to sexual violence where Mr. Depp, based on her report, was subjected to none. And then on the danger assessment scale, that there were a number of factors that were related to severity in violent relationships and a risk factor. When we look, as I said earlier, when behaviors come up on this scale, they're very worrisome, very scary, and we have to take them seriously. So there were a number of behaviors that came up on this scale, such as Mr. Depp threatens to kill her, the increase in severity of the abuse, the forced sexual activity, the choking behavior,
Please continue.
the obsessive jealousy, the control aspect, and his threatening of suicide to kill himself. So those were risk factors that placed her in the increased danger range. And this is a range that, says that we certainly have to advise women of their risk and consult with law enforcement if they're involved, or judges if they're involved, because this means that a woman is at risk for more serious or lethal domestic violence.
So did the results of the psychological tests you administered to Amber Heard support a diagnosis of PTSD?
Objection leading.
What, if any, psychological tests did you administer that supported a diagnosis of PTSD for Amber Heard?
Sure. So there were 4 tests that supported that diagnosis. One was the PAI, which was that 344 question large scale personality inventory. On that test, her largest subscale, her highest subscale, was the one that measures traumatic stress. So that was clinically significant. On the TSI, 2 of her scales were the intrusive experiences dimension and the defensive avoidance dimension, 2 of the classic scales of trauma and PTSD. On the PCL, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist 5, that she scored in all 4 domains of PTSD, and that's an instrument that says how much are you bothered by these symptoms. And in all 4 clusters, which would be the intrusive experiencing, when things about the abuse or the trauma enter your mind when you did not want them to. Sometimes they're cued, sometimes they're uncued. She answered in the avoidance category, which is a second category of PTSD, that I do things to try not to think about this, to try not to feel this, to try not to get upset. Sometimes I avoid certain people because they become a trigger for me. She scored in what we call the negative alterations in cognition and mood, changes in her thoughts and feelings as a result of the abuse and trauma, and also in the physiological hyperactivity, the hyperarousal, the hypervigilance, the startle response. So on the PCL, she endorsed symptoms in all 4 of those categories, saying, some of these symptoms are bothering me a lot. And then finally, the clinician-administered PTSD scale for the DSM-5. And what that allows me to do, unlike the PCL, is really look at symptom severity and symptom frequency. How is this really playing out for this individual? And similarly, she scored in all 4 categories of trauma and of having intrusive experiences and nightmares and avoidance efforts and physiological hyperactivity and changes in her mood and her thoughts. And her total score was a 28, which falls in the moderate range. So that means that she has experiencing a moderate degree of post-traumatic stress disorder symptomatology. And those tests allow me to make that definitive diagnosis that she suffers from PTSD.
Thank you. What, if any, consideration did you give to Amber Heard's history of childhood abuse in making your diagnosis?
I mean, that was a significant consideration, given that we know that childhood, well, first of all, we know that people can experience multiple traumas across the lifespan. And we wanted to make sure that the symptoms that she was experiencing were related to what she experienced with Mr. Depp and not her childhood. And certainly, earlier on in the evaluation and when I evaluated and spoke with her, that was true. And that was also true on the latest measure, the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5, the CAPS-5. And that's because the content, you have to look at what is the content of the symptom. So it's not that someone says, oh yeah, something traumatic comes into my mind. No, what is it? What comes into your mind? What bothers you? What are the triggers? And those were all specific to Ms. Heard's relationship with Mr. Depp. The reason the childhood is also significant is that we know that if somebody suffers childhood abuse as a child, they are much more likely to have an adult re-victimization. And they're much more likely then to be more vulnerable to obtaining a PTSD, to getting PTSD, if they've had that prior vulnerability. So it's a very strong vulnerability characteristic to obtaining PTSD when you have a subsequent trauma. The other aspect about her childhood abuse is that she was raised in a family of violence. She was physically abused by her father. She saw her father abuse her mother. Her father was very explosive and had violent outbursts. And both her parents also struggled with substance abuse very significantly. So she had learned from a very early age how to caretake, how to live in a situation that is mired in chaos. How do I take care of a parent who's passed out, knotted out from heroin? And how do I get up and get my sister to school? She learned at a very early age that she had to figure out how to do this in this scenario. And I would say lastly, what that environment taught her was that she learned that she could love someone who hurts her. She knew that people who hurt her also can love her. And she learned how to have this tolerance for cognitive inconsistency, revealing clothing, or revealing clothing according to him. She recalled an incident when she was going on a job audition, and he said, you're going to go out with those tits and ass, and she had to sort of go in and put on what she said, mom jeans, so that she didn't look sexy, so she didn't look revealing, and continue to try to plead with him about what jobs she could take and she could not take. This made her be very sort of restrictive and try to conceal things. She would hide her scripts because she couldn't read them in front of him because he would put them down or want to see where there might be nudity, where there might be something where she's doing a love scene. And then every almost every person that she was in a film with, there would be those barrages of the consistent accusations of infidelity. And we saw that on the Australia pictures, the Billy Bob. He was one person that he continued, to berate her about having an affair with. That's what obsessive control looks like, those messages on the mirror. When you look at how he wanted her to there was some interference with the family, with her sister, when some things were leaked. He was obsessed, believing that it was Whitney who did it, and eventually Miss Heard had to succumb and say, okay, yes, it was, and then alienate herself from her sister because she just couldn't take the fights anymore. She just couldn't take the constant barrage of criticism. So there were many instances when, in terms of their interactions, she would have to text him right back, but when she would text him, he could not answer for days. And it's this sort of, when we talk about, the ghosting, but your husband doesn't ghost you, your partner doesn't ghost you. And there were so many times of this sort of withdrawal of affection, which was on his terms and when he wanted to do it. I'm aware that there is, testimony in this case that, Mr. Depp decided to leave because he didn't want to be violent. And I do think that's true sometimes. I think he did leave in times where he didn't want an altercation. He did leave after an altercation. He did leave and then came back and continued the altercation. So leaving wasn't the defining variable. The problem was that, with this obsessiveness and this perseveration that he had, the fight would always come back. So leaving might end the argument for that moment, but Miss Heard knew he was always going to come back, and he was going to, start the interrogation once again.
And what is the effect of the coercive control on Amber Heard?
I mean, the effect was drastic. She talked to me that her roles consistently dropped over the time that she was in the relationship with Mr. Depp, just because it was so difficult to go on auditions, to want to be in a different location with him. Whenever she was not on location with him, it was very stressful. It was very anxiety-provoking because of the accusations of infidelity. We heard that through Isaac Baruch's testimony when she called and was saying, babe, there's no one here, there's no one here. That was something that she had to do repeatedly and constantly over the course of the relationship. So it caused a significant amount of anxiety, of distress, of having to try to conceal and maneuver around him to try to have the career that she wanted to have. It made her hypervigilant, and definitely contributed to sort of her psychological symptomatology getting worse over time.
What about sexual violence?
So there was a number of incidents of sexual violence reported in this relationship. Those are documented early on in Dr. Bonnie Jacobs' notes, where when Mr. Depp was drunk or high, he threw her on the bed, ripped off her nightgown, and tried to have sex with her. There were times when he forced her to give him oral sex when he was angry. These weren't in loving moments. These were angry moments, moments of dominance, moments of him trying to get control over her. There was a time when they were in Hicksville in the trailer, I don't want to say trailer park, but I guess it's trailer park. It is a trailer park, where he was accusing her of a woman hitting on Amber, and that was the problem. Amber got accused of women hitting on her, and it got accused of men hitting on her. So there were so many targets that came through in his obsessive jealousy. But when he, on that incident when Kelly Sue was accused of hitting on Miss Heard, and they went back into the trailer, Mr. Depp performed a cavity search and ostensibly was looking for drugs and felt it acceptable to rip off her nightgown and stick his fingers up her vagina to look for cocaine, thought that maybe she was hiding them there. And again, these incidents often happened in a drug-fueled rage. There was another incident in the Bahamas where when he got angry, he took his fingers and he put them in her vagina and moved her around violently in the closet. Again, an act of sexual violence. And of course, the incident in Australia was one of the most severe instances of sexual violence that Miss Heard had to endure, in which when he was beating her and choking her and telling her, I'm going to fucking kill you, I hate you, I'm going to fucking kill you, and he grabbed a bottle that was on the bar and penetrated her with that bottle. And Miss Heard reported to me of dissociating and going outside of her body, and the only thing she was thinking is, oh God, I hope it's not the broken one.
What, if any, psychological abuse did you find?
There was a number of psychologically abusive behaviors. As I stated, Miss Heard admitted to me and reported that she engaged in those behaviors as well. She reported that she did call him names and offensive comments and said things to him that were horrible, and that she was incredibly saddened and horrified by her behavior. And looking back, she, at this point, not being in the constant barrage of abuse, does not recognize her. The abuse by Mr. Depp, he called her a number of names, frequently whore, slut, cunt, lesbian camp counselor, easy, ambition. Ambition was a weaponized term in that relationship. So he called her a lot of names and humiliated her. And of course, I think we talked about the intimidation tactics that, Mr. Depp was often banging and throwing and hitting things in the household, which sort of got the tension to rise up very significantly, very quickly.
Can you tell me how you conducted your analysis to arrive at these conclusions?
Sure. So what I did was look at the incidents that were reported and look at the corroborating data around it. So as we stated, most of these incidents of intimate partner violence happen behind closed doors. Not everyone is going to witness what the parties are reporting behind closed doors. So you look at what is the data that surrounds it. Is there any data before it? Is there any data after it? Is the victim telling somebody in real time about what's happening? Are there therapy notes? Are there pictures? Are there text messages that sort of allow us to fill in the pieces of the picture, even though we don't have exactly what happened at that moment? The more collateral that we have and the consistency across those data points, it gives us greater confidence in our results.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So
Vague.
Overruled, I'll allow.
So, for example, the Boston plane incident, I believe, without looking, I know May 24th, 2014. This is the incident where Ms. Heard and Mr. Depp were going to fly back to LA and spend the weekend together. They were shooting at different sites. Ms. Heard is on the plane waiting for Mr. Depp to come on in the tarmac. He's reportedly sitting in the SUV, smoking weed and drinking. She is filming with James Franco at this point, and she gets on the plane and he starts talking about James Franco, making a lot of derogatory comments about her, and I hope you had fun with your escapades, and some more inflammatory language. And then in an argument, when she got up to leave, he kicked her in the back and she went forward on the plane. To the front of the plane, because he sat in the back of the plane. So if I look at what is the corresponding data to this, there's a therapy note, several notes in Bonnie Jacobs' records that talk about Mr. Depp's increasing use of alcohol and his obsessive jealousy around James Franco before this Boston plane incident. After the incident, Ms. Heard told her friend Io, she told her friend Savannah, she told her friend Rocky. Ms. Heard did not go home. She was afraid to go home. So she went to a hotel, because when Johnny was in these states, he would often show up because he's still in that drinking and drugging phase. And he talked about that. That was the roxycodone before he detoxed. He was still in that, high substance abuse phase, that he would often show up at night, and that did not feel safe. There was a text from Stephen Duders, Mr. Depp's assistant.
All right.
All right, so, Dr. Hughes, let's go past that text and talk about, go past that text and continue after that text.
Sure. So there was, Mr. Depp apologized to Ms. Heard for that incident. Mr. Depp said in his UK testimony, well, I only maybe playfully tapped her on the back with my foot. Mr. Depp texted Paul Bettany and talked about how he was so drunk and out of control and engaged in bad behavior. He texted his friend Patty Smith a very similar type of text about how drunk and out of control he was. And then finally, Amber Heard wrote an email talking about how distressed and heartbroken she was.
Objection, hearsay.
I mean, I don't agree.
I know you sustain. I'll sustain the objection. Next question.
All right. Can you give another example?
I think those are all I can remember at this point.
Okay. What if any, sorry, I'm going to have to go a little bit further here. So you concluded that Amber Heard used psychological abuse and some reactive physical violence, I think I heard you say. Is that correct?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
Can you please explain to the jury what you meant by that?
Yes, that is correct. That, Amber Heard reported to me some of the behaviors that she used that were psychologically aggressive, the name calling, the putting him down and calling him very bad names and insulting his fatherhood, and she was very shamed and remorseful about that. She also indicated, using, and as some of the testing showed, minor forms of violence, pushing, shoving, throwing objects. We see that a lot with women when there's not proportional force. Women are more likely to throw objects. And then the more severe act of punching him, which a punch falls in the more severe category. And the context, as she explained it, was that he was coming after Whitney, and she stood, her sister, and she stood in the way and she punched him.
Now, does that make Amber Heard a perpetrator of intimate partner violence?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
So that was one of the tasks that I had to consider. That was one of the hypotheses that I had to consider. And given all of the other data, that was not my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Now, you stated that you read a number of therapy records. Please tell the jury, why are therapy records important?
Therapy records are critical for a forensic psychologist. When we have the opportunity to go back in time and see what a person was dealing with, what the content of their distress was, and what the symptoms of their distress was, it really gives us a snapshot in time. So they become very critical as part of the overall forensic psychological evaluation, because we as psychologists understand how people sort of treat in therapy and what to look for. So in looking back at Ms. Heard's therapy records, we see sort of real-time unfolding of this dynamic in this relationship. We see early on in her notes in her report with Bonnie Jacobs and in Dr. Bonnie Jacobs' notes, reports of constant concerns about Mr. Depp's substance abuse, constant concerns about him passing out and vomiting, constant concerns about not
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
She can characterize that and say she relied on that.
Overruled.
Thank you. Please continue.
Constant concerns about how do I get him into treatment, how do I get him help. Ms. Heard starts going to Al-Anon at this point, early 2012, in the beginning of the relationship, because she has to figure out and wants to figure out a way to support the man that she's dating right now and the man who she's falling madly in love with. There are reports in Dr. Jacobs' notes early on about his controlling behavior, about his jealousy behavior, about him not wanting to do certain jobs, of not wanting her to wear certain clothes. So this is going back to 2012 with no indication of why would she be saying that but for the sole purpose of trying to get help and trying to get guidance in this relationship that she finds so difficult. There are indications, as I mentioned before, of the sexual assault and the sexual abuse and how he would, when he was angry and when he was drunk, it was mostly drug and alcohol fueled rage when he would, throw her on the bed and try to have sex with her. And then, if he was not not able to perform, he would get more angry at her and blame her. So we have this dynamic of blaming her for his inability to take responsibility for his behavior. Those themes were throughout Dr. Jacobs' notes.
Did Dr. Jacobs assign any diagnoses to Amber Heard?
She did. Early
one?
on, she diagnosed her with panic disorder, and then later with post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right. And did Dr. Jacobs diagnose Amber Heard with borderline personality disorder?
No, she did not.
Histrionic personality disorder?
No, she did not.
And is that important?
That's very important when we're trying to figure out the course of somebody's illness, the course of somebody's psychiatric difficulties. As I stated, well, I don't think I got to state, personality disorders usually start in adolescence early.
Objection.
I'll sustain the objection. Next
Okay.
question.
Okay. You also stated that you reviewed Dr. Connell Cowan's treatment notes, correct?
Correct.
And you also read his deposition testimony?
Correct.
And you had how long of a collateral interview with him?
I believe it was 2 hours.
Okay. And what did you get from all of that data?
So by the time that she gets to Dr. Connell Cowan, which is 2014, I believe, September 2014 is when Dr. Kipper comes on the scene. Ms. Heard's psychological functioning is significantly deteriorated. She's suffering more anxiety, more sleeplessness, more agitation, more emotional dysregulation, this fluctuation in moods. And when you sort of look at the records of what happened in those first 2 years from Dr. Jacobs, and now we have up to Dr. Connell Cowan, and we see all of the incidents that she was exposed to, including the sexual violence and the coercive control, it makes sense to me that her status, her psychological functioning has deteriorated. And in Dr. Connell Cowan's notes, that's what he's always trying to do. He's trying to help her, help Mr. Depp, help her act in a way so that Mr. Depp does not hurt her. Dr. Connell Cowan was very concerned for Amber Heard's safety, as was Dr. Bonnie Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs was very concerned for her safety, and she continued to talk about safety aspects for Ms. Heard, as was Connell Cowan. They did, both of them, both therapists, understood, and Ms. Heard talked to them about it, that there were times that she fought back and she used violence, and times that she screamed and she said things that she didn't want to. But nevertheless, that did not change the balance for them either, and they were very concerned that because of Mr. Depp's significant substance abuse and his sort of poorly controlled anger, that at some point he was going to seriously hurt her.
Did Dr. Cowan provide Ms. Heard with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder?
No, he did not.
Did he diagnose Amber Heard with histrionic personality disorder?
No, he did not.
Is that important?
It's important that you have an individual, Ms. Heard, who's in therapy for over 2 years with one therapist and over 2 years with another therapist, and you're not seeing those characteristics of a personality disorder. If the manifestation of a person's difficulties and illness and symptomatology is better explained by another disorder, then you don't qualify for the personality disorder. You can't get the diagnosis. That's part of the criteria. So if it's not a pervasive pattern in a variety of contexts, and it can't be better explained by her trauma experience and the exposure and the symptoms as a result of that trauma, then you don't get a personality disorder. And that's why they didn't diagnose it.
Did you read Dr. Amy Banks' deposition testimony?
Yes, I did.
And what were her findings?
So Dr. Banks had one session, one couple session with Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard. Dr. Banks is very reputable. She works up at the Harvard Medical School Cambridge Victim of Violence Program, which is a very well-known program for understanding.
Objection, Your Honor.
What's the objection?
It's non-responsive to the question. The question was, what was the findings?
All right.
Tell the jury who Dr. Amy Banks is.
And just like I said, so she's somebody who has a wealth of experience in understanding intimate partner violence and the dynamics of violent relationships. But she only had one session with the couple, and it was her determination when they were both there and the violence was talked about that Mr. Depp did not deny the violence that he perpetrated toward Miss Heard. She also did, as everybody has, all of our other therapists, because Ms. Heard admitted as such, that she also used low levels of violence as well. So Dr. Amy Banks had that opinion.
Did you review Dr. Laurel Anderson's treatment notes and read her deposition?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what was the significance of what you learned from Dr. Anderson?
So Dr. Anderson similarly thought that there was violence and abuse in this relationship. She was the one therapist out of the 4 who qualified it as mutual abuse, which the termination I've talked to you about, I don't necessarily agree with. But she did see and did understand that there was violence and abuse by Mr. Depp. What was most notable was that after the December 15th, 2015 episode, Ms. Heard called her, in addition to calling Connell Cohen, and reached out to a number of people. But she saw Dr. Anderson in her office, and Dr. Anderson saw 2 bruises on her face and told me, my husband kicked me, and he pushed me, and he punched me in the head. And should I call the police?
Objection, Your Honor.
What should I do?
She's not reading, Your Honor. She's just saying the significance.
Sustain the objection. Next
Okay.
question.
All right. What were your, what conclusions did you make as a result of what you reviewed for Dr. Laurel Anderson?
My take of reading Dr. Laurel Anderson's deposition and seeing her, redacted notes was that, from my professional opinion, this was a very serious incident and a very serious allegation of intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp. If a patient comes into my office with 2 bruises and alleges being pushed, shoved, and kicked by her partner, I'm going to be very concerned, and I'm going to mobilize a lot more resources to help that individual. And for some reason, that did not happen for Ms. Heard.
What are your overall clinical impressions from reading these notes from Amber Heard's treatment providers and their couples therapists?
Objection, compound.
All right, sustained.
What are your overall clinical impressions from reading what you told everybody you read?
Objection, compound.
I mean, I don't know how to get it less compound, Your Honor.
Overruled. Go ahead.
Thank you.
So my overall impression of the treatment notes was, there's significant support for the fact that there was intimate partner violence in this relationship. It was consistently reported over time, and there were couples therapists who saw and understood that. There were, Mr. Depp also attended a session with Dr. Connell Cohen with Ms. Heard. And in that session, he was very belligerent and mean and yelling and intimidating, and he even got up and stormed out, rolled a joint, and then came back later. Dr. Connell Cohen's impression was this is somebody who's poorly controlled. That's the same thing that Dr. Laurel Anderson said about him. And he stormed out of one of those sessions too. So there were a total of 6 sessions, couple session, but Mr. Depp stormed out of 2 of them. So there were only 4 couple sessions for these 2 individuals in this just highly volatile, highly damaging relationship that was, punctuated by the coercive control and the intimate partner violence.
What, if any, observations did you make about Amber Heard's psychological status over that period?
I mean, the record was very clear that her psychological status deteriorated as she was in the relationship with Mr. Depp. She kept getting worse. She was losing weight. By the end, she was down to, I think, 105 pounds from about 125, 130. She was taking significantly more medication than she's ever taken in her life. She was having more panic, more anxiety, more distress, more affect dysregulation, just really an inability to regulate her mood, more anger outbursts. So it can significantly deteriorate over time.
You talked about weight. What, if any, diagnoses did Bonnie Jacobs make about Amber Heard having an eating disorder?
There was no evidence in the record that Ms. Hurd had an eating disorder.
What, if any, observations did you make about whether Dr. Cowan-Connell thought she had an eating disorder?
There was no indication in his record that she had an eating disorder.
Now, what, if any, observations did you make about the impact of Mr. Depp's substance abuse?
So the substance abuse was a very relevant and complicating factor to this relationship. When you pair that level of substance abuse with the level of intimate partner violence and coercive control, it's a very, very disastrous mix. And one of the things that happens with the substance abuse is a very similar dynamic that happens with the intimate partner violence. That there's the lying, there's the hiding, there's the cheating, there's the obfuscation, the rationalization about the drinking, the rationalization about the violence, the trying to, promises, I'm going to do better, I'm going to get clean and sober, I'm not going to hit you anymore.
Objection,
So
Your Honor. Can I be heard?
You can approach.
What, if any, dynamics and coping styles are connected to the substance abuse by Mr. Depp?
So they share similarities. There's a lot of lying when somebody's a substance abuser. There's a lot of hiding. There's a lot of concealment. There's a lot of rationalization. There's a lot of blame, blaming your partner for your inability to stay clean and sober. There's a lot of the promises to change and the promises to get better. So a lot of these dynamics sort of co-occur, in a situation of substance abuse and domestic violence. They're very similar. The difficulty in this relationship was that the majority of the violent episodes and the sexually violent episodes were in these alcohol and drug-fueled rages. That was predominantly when those happened. When he wasn't in those stages, we still saw the obsessive jealousy and the coercive control and the possessiveness. That still persisted. But when the alcohol and the drugs came together is when Amber Heard was more in danger of being hurt by him.
Why didn't Amber Heard leave the relationship sooner?
Well, you know why.
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
Have you formed, based on your experience and based on your 29 hours of clinical evaluation of Amber Heard, what is your understanding of why Amber Heard didn't leave the relationship earlier?
Objection beyond the scope of the disclosure.
It clearly is not. It's clearly in the disclosure. Point to where you say it's not.
Point to where you say it's not.
Now, you indicated that your main opinion was that Amber Heard's report of violence and abuse in her relationship with Mr. Depp is consistent with what is known as intimate partner violence, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And why did you believe that Amber Heard, what formed your basis of that opinion, in a nutshell?
Asked and answered, Your Honor.
Overruled, I'll allow it.
The basis of the opinion was looking at all the dynamics in this relationship, looking at not just the hitting and the yelling, but looking at how much more hitting was done, looking at the coercive control, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the sexual violence, the choking behavior, the threats to kill. Those are all, as I stated, very significant and often found in cases of lethal domestic violence. Those were significant severity factors, and looking at all those, that's what tipped the scales, that even though she yelled and said some horrible things and hit him, it never was able to shift the balance of power and control in that relationship.
Now, you have discussed with Amber Heard and you have reviewed and evaluated the emotional impact on Amber Heard as a result of emotional distress as a result of the 3 counterclaim statements, correct? The 3 alleged defamatory statements made by Mr. Depp through Mr. Waldman, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Objection,
And-
compound leading.
Just
Overruled, I'll allow it. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Could you please tell the jury what psychological impact these statements had on Amber Heard?
Yes, so there were 3 statements that I evaluated. May I check my notes to give you the dates and my recollection so that I can be clear?
Since I couldn't put it in, this might be the fastest way, Your Honor.
I'd rather she not address the court. I mean,
I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there were 3 statements on April 8th, 2020, April 27th, 2020, and June 24th, 2020 that I queried her about and asked her about. The one that, what happens is if somebody who, like Ms. Heard, has trauma-based symptoms and PTSD, we say that PTSD is a cue-based disorder. There are things that happen in the environment that trigger it and make it worse. And have to refute that your report of violence and abuse is a hoax makes that trauma activated. So it makes the PTSD symptoms at that time become more intense and more severe. So she would have more intrusive thoughts, more nightmares, more sleeplessness, more difficulty engaging with other people, depression, sadness, stress. All of that would happen when one of these statements came out. The one that was, the most difficult was the one where they said that her sexual violence
Objection, Your Honor.
Please continue.
The one that was most difficult for Ms. Heard was the statement about calling her sexual violence a hoax. As I stated earlier, most women try very diligently to put that sexual violence in a box, bury it down, not want to talk about it, not want to have anything related to it come up. And, she's done, by my estimation in her coping, although she suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, she also has a high degree of coping strategies. But when this would happen, it sort of everything would deteriorate. And this is the one thing that women are always afraid of, that no one's going to believe them. No one's going to take them seriously. And when somebody comes out in the popular media and calls your experience a hoax, that lended itself to more severe psychological and traumatic symptomatology for her.
Dr. Hughes, are all of your opinions that you have provided today within a reasonable degree of psychological probability or certainty?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
all right.